It was early October when I decided to take a solo camping trip to Maple Ridge, a secluded spot about 2 hours outside of town. I had been thinking about it for months. Getting away from the chaos of everyday life, spending some time in nature, and having the peace and quiet that I so desperately needed. I didn't tell many people about the trip. I was used to being alone, and camping was something I enjoyed, especially in the fall when the leaves were changing and the air had a crisp bite to it. The drive was uneventful. I rolled down the windows, let the fresh air fill the car, and sang along to whatever music came on the radio. It was just me and the road. After I parked my car near the trailhead, I threw my backpack over my shoulder and started walking towards the campsite, located a few miles up the trail. The sun was already beginning to set, casting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The trail was familiar, or so I thought. I'd camped at Maple Ridge before, but not for a few years. It was supposed to be a place of calm, a place to disconnect. As the trail twisted through the dense woods, I noticed how much the place had changed since I had last been there. Some trees had fallen, their trunks now rotting on the ground. Others had grown taller, their branches reaching higher into the sky like the fingers of giants. I kept walking, the rustle of fallen leaves under my boots and the occasional distant bird call being the only sounds. By the time I reached the clearing, it was dark, and the temperature had dropped significantly. I set up my tent quickly, fumbling with the poles in the fading light. I was tired from the hike, but I didn't mind. This was what I had come for, the stillness, the time to myself. Once the tent was set up, I built a fire. The crackling of the flames felt comforting, and for a moment, I let myself relax. The night was peaceful, with the only interruptions being the occasional crack of a branch or the rustle of leaves in the wind. I could hear some animals in the distance. Deer, maybe, nothing too close, nothing to worry about. I cooked a simple dinner, some canned chili and crackers, and sat by the fire, eating quietly. The smell of the burning wood and the cool night air were strangely soothing, and for the first time in weeks, I felt at ease. After finishing my meal, I sat back against a tree, staring up at the stars. There was no moon that night, so the sky was completely clear. The stars seemed endless, stretching across the black expanse above me. I felt small, insignificant in the best possible way. I was about to call it a night when I heard something. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a squirrel. But then, the sound repeated. A low crunching noise, like something heavy moving through the brush. My head snapped around, my heart picking up pace. I sat up straighter, scanning the darkness. The fire crackled, its light flickering across the woods, but the sound had stopped. Could have been an animal. It had to be, right? I listened for a few more minutes, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. But there it was again, a slow crunch, closer this time. I grabbed the flashlight from my backpack and clicked it on, the beam slicing through the night. Nothing, just trees and shadows. It was probably just the wind, I told myself, but something felt off. I didn't like the idea of being out here alone, especially with that odd noise lurking in the background. I stood up and started to pace around the campsite, looking out into the woods. Nothing, just the usual sounds of the forest at night, the rustle of branches, the occasional bird chirping, the wind. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The crunching noises didn't help. After a few minutes, I decided to call it a night. I zipped up the tent and settled inside, trying to put my mind at ease. The noises stopped, but the uneasy feeling didn't. I lay there in the dark, staring at the fabric of the tent above me, willing myself to sleep. It wasn't until hours later, around 2 a.m., that I heard it again, this time much closer. A faint tapping, like something was gently knocking on the outside of the tent. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew no one else was out here. The trailhead parking lot was empty when I passed it earlier. No one was supposed to be this far out in the woods. I slowly sat up, my flashlight clutched tightly in my hand. I reached for the zipper of the tent and hesitated. Was it an animal? Maybe a bear? Or a raccoon? No, it didn't sound like that. The tapping was too deliberate, too controlled. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The light from the fire was still flickering weakly. There was nothing in front of me but the dark shadows of trees. The tapping stopped as soon as I opened the zipper, and the woods went completely still. I quickly zipped the tent back up and sat down in a daze. My thoughts were racing, trying to figure out what had just happened, trying to make sense of the night. But there was no sense to it. There was only that feeling, that nagging sense that something was terribly wrong. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the tapping, the crunching, the rustling, each noise seeming to come from a different direction, closing in on me. By morning, the unease had turned into full-on paranoia. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there, watching me, waiting. The air was cold as we hiked deeper into the woods. It was early November, and the trees were just starting to lose their leaves, which crunched beneath our boots with every step. I was with my friend Jake, both of us eager to get away from the noise of the city. We'd been planning this camping trip for months, picking out the perfect spot, far enough from the nearest campground so we wouldn't be bothered, but not too far to make the hike unbearable. At least that's what we thought. We had arrived at the campsite the previous evening, just as the sun was beginning to set. It was quiet, still, the kind of silence that makes you realize how loud the world normally is. There was a small clearing surrounded by thick trees, and a stream ran nearby, perfect for a campfire and to settle in for the night. We made our fire and spent a few hours talking, drinking, and joking around. There was nothing particularly unusual about the place. It felt like any other campsite I'd ever been to. I woke up around 3 in the morning. It was freezing outside, and I could hear the wind howling through the trees. Jake was snoring beside me, wrapped in his sleeping bag, and I tried to settle back into my own, but something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was an uneasy feeling crawling over me. I dismissed it, telling myself I was just being paranoid. I had heard stories, sure, but that was all they were. Stories. I rolled over, trying to get comfortable. It was then that I heard something, soft at first, like a branch snapping in the distance. I froze, straining to listen. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate, slow. Something was out there. I sat up slowly, careful not to wake Jake. My flashlight was in the pocket of my jacket, so I grabbed it and flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness of the tent, but when I looked around the clearing outside, everything seemed still. The trees swayed slightly, the fire had died down to embers, and the stream gurgled softly. I was about to lie back down when I heard it again. A crack, much closer this time. My heart skipped a beat. I slowly unzipped the tent and poked my head out, the cold air biting at my skin. I scanned the area with the flashlight, but nothing moved. The wind kicked up again, causing the branches above me to creak and groan, and I swore I saw something shift behind the tree line. I couldn't make out what it was, but it was big. The kind of large shape that didn't belong in a forest unless it was a bear or something larger. My breath hitched in my throat. The sound was gone, but I could feel my instincts telling me to be cautious. I turned back to Jake, who was still asleep, oblivious to whatever was making me feel like I was being watched. I stayed at the edge of the tent for a few minutes, trying to calm my breathing. Maybe it was just an animal. Bears didn't really come around this part of the woods, but other things did. A raccoon, maybe, or a deer. It didn't matter. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I decided I was being silly and went back to sleep, but the unease stuck with me. I tossed and turned for hours, listening to every crackle of the trees and every rustle in the underbrush. The more I listened, the more it seemed like something was out there. Something was waiting for the right moment to move. At dawn, I woke up again, this time to Jake shaking me awake. "Hey, are you good? You look like you haven't slept at all." I blinked, disoriented. The light outside was dim, and the sky was overcast. I could barely remember falling asleep, but now that Jake was up, the tension of the night seemed to have loosened. "Yeah, just didn't sleep well. Weird dreams." Jake just nodded, pulling himself up and stretching. He was always the early riser, full of energy, while I liked to sleep in a little longer. "I'm gonna grab some firewood. You want to help?" I almost told him no, but the thought of being outside in the open for a bit sounded like a good way to shake off the weird feeling I still had. "Sure," I said, pulling on my boots and zipping up my jacket. "Let's go." The woods were even colder now, and the air smelled of damp earth and pine. The forest seemed quieter than before, which I thought was odd. It was as if the birds and animals had all gone silent. But I pushed the thought aside and followed Jake as we trekked a little deeper into the trees to find dry wood. We were both carrying axes, our hands numb from the cold, when Jake suddenly stopped and pointed ahead. "Hey, look at that." I squinted. Ahead of us, near the edge of the trees, there was something strange. A bundle of twigs and branches piled in a small, neat heap. It didn't look natural. It wasn't the way the forest grew. It looked arranged like someone had carefully placed the wood in that spot. "That's weird," I muttered. "Who would leave something like that here?" Jake frowned. "I don't know, man. Looks like someone's been out here recently." I felt my stomach tighten. There was something unsettling about it, as if the woods had suddenly taken on a different vibe. I wasn't sure what it was, but I didn't like the feeling creeping up on me. We decided to leave it alone and moved past it to gather firewood, but I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder as we worked, half expecting to see something. Someone, standing just out of sight. When we returned to camp, I noticed something else that set my nerves on edge. Our packs, which had been zipped up and tucked safely near the tent, had been moved. Not much, but enough to be noticeable. The top flap of mine was slightly open, and the way the straps hung looked like someone had disturbed it. "Did you touch my stuff?" I asked Jake, trying to sound casual. "Nope," he said, shaking his head. "Why?" I looked around, trying to figure out if someone had come through while we were out, but there was no sign of anyone, no tracks or footprints. Still, the feeling was gnawing at me. I didn't want to admit it, but I was getting the creeping sense that we weren't alone, and it was more than just a bear or some wild animal. As the day dragged on, I couldn't shake the feeling. I kept thinking I heard footsteps around the campsite, branches snapping in the distance, or a soft rustling like someone was walking just beyond the treeline. But every time I turned to look, nothing was there. I was starting to feel paranoid, and Jake was starting to notice. "You good, man? You've been acting weird all day." I didn't know how to explain it, so I just shrugged it off. "I'm fine, just tired. Maybe we should pack up and head out soon." Jake wasn't convinced. "It's not even dark yet. We've still got time before we need to leave." I wasn't so sure. The sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains, and the woods were growing darker by the minute. I had this feeling, this unshakable dread, that we needed to leave. Now, we spent the next hour packing our things, keeping a lookout for anything that seemed out of place. I was hyper-aware of every sound, every movement in the woods. I was ready to go, but Jake was in no rush. "Relax, dude. It's just the woods. Nothing's gonna happen." But then, just as we were about to finish packing, I heard it again. A snap of a twig, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy breathing. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. I spun around, my flashlight sweeping over the trees. Nothing, but I knew something was out there, watching. I grabbed my bag and said, "Jake, let's go. Now." Jake looked at me, confused, but when he saw the panic in my eyes, he didn't argue. We finished gathering the last of our gear and started down the trail, moving quickly. The whole way back, I kept glancing over my shoulder, sure that someone or something was following us. When we finally reached the car, I felt a huge wave of relief. We threw our things in the back, and I slammed the door shut. Jake was still quiet, but I could see he was shaken too. "Let's just get out of here," I muttered, turning the key in the ignition. As we drove down the dirt road, I looked back one last time. The woods were just as they had always been, silent and still, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there with us, something watching, waiting, and I realized then that whatever it was better that we left before it decided to come any closer. It had been a while since I'd gone camping, long enough for me to forget the raw, quiet silence of the wilderness. I'm not exactly a seasoned outdoorsman. The extent of my hiking experience was a couple of quick weekend trips with friends. But this time I was on my own, heading into Lake Eastwood's dense woods. I wanted to escape from the noise, the traffic, and all the stuff that constantly filled my head. It had been an exhausting few months. Work, life, everything. I just needed a break. I drove up alone, just my backpack, a tent, and my truck. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon when I parked by the lake. The air was cool, and the scent of pine and damp earth filled my nose. I wasn't exactly roughing it either. I'd taken some precautions. I made sure to pack a first aid kit, some non-perishable food, and extra layers in case the temperature dropped during the night. I set up my tent with minimal hassle, although there was a constant buzz of mosquitoes around my ears. Nothing was terribly out of place. The lake was quiet, and the forest stood still, with no wind stirring the tall trees around me. It felt peaceful, maybe a bit too peaceful. By the time my tent was up, I was ready for a quick dinner. I had brought some freeze-dried meals with me, simple enough to just add hot water. I set up a little camp stove, boiling the water in a kettle while watching the glow of the fire from the stove flicker against the darkening sky. There was something calming about that, the fire in the stillness. The first few hours were exactly what I expected. I sat by the campfire, eating, watching the stars emerge one by one as the sky darkened. My mind wandered. I had almost forgotten how beautiful it could be to hear nothing but the sounds of the night. The occasional ripple of water, the rustling of small animals moving through the underbrush, the crackling of the fire. But then, something shifted. I couldn't tell exactly when it happened, but a feeling started to settle in my gut. Tension. A sense of being watched, like something or someone was out there, just out of sight. I convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks. The night was just getting started, and I was probably overthinking things. As the fire began to die down, I doused it with some water to avoid any sparks. I retreated into the tent and zipped it up. I lay there for a while, staring at the faint outlines of trees against the dark sky through the small opening. The sounds of the forest were still there, but they felt a little heavier now. The wind started to pick up slightly, making the branches creak. It wasn't long before I drifted off to sleep, but it wasn't a deep sleep. Every time I would start to fade, something would jerk me awake. Perhaps the distant snap of a twig or the faintest rustle of leaves. Nothing alarming, but enough to make my heart beat a little faster. The night stretched on. At one point, I heard a low, sharp bark, not far from the campsite. Coyote, I thought. They were common around here. But the sound was followed by something else, something I couldn't immediately place. A scratching like claws on bark. I told myself it was just an animal, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. I woke up to a crisp morning, the kind where the air feels fresh and the sky looks impossibly clear. The tension from the night had faded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been wrong. I checked my gear. Everything seemed fine. The food was where I had left it, and nothing appeared to have been disturbed outside. I decided to take a walk along the shore of the lake. The water was still, and the early morning mist hung in the air, drifting lazily over the surface. The hike wasn't far, just a loop around the lake. As I walked, I kept scanning the trees, half expecting to see someone who didn't belong there. The woods seemed endless, and as I walked farther from my campsite, the isolation began to feel a little suffocating. The longer I walked, the more I realized how much more remote this place was than I initially thought. I had been out here a couple of times before, but always in a group. It didn't feel as desolate when there were others around to keep the mood light. Alone, with no other sounds besides my footsteps and the occasional bird call, the wilderness seemed much more alive. As I reached a bend in the trail, I noticed something odd. A section of the woods had been disturbed, branches broken, leaves crushed. It looked like someone had been walking through here recently, but the trail was old, faded. No footprints in the dirt, just the odd mess of broken branches and crushed underbrush. I hesitated. Could have just been wildlife, but something about it made me uneasy. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I turned around, deciding to head back to my camp. The sooner I could get back to my tent, the better. But as I walked, I noticed something else. There was a small, faded red mark on one of the trees. At first, I thought it might be a piece of cloth or something, but as I got closer, I realized it was too faded and too embedded in the bark to be fabric. It was some sort of strange, jagged marking, almost like someone had carved into the tree, but it didn't look fresh. It looked old, too old. I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that something wasn't right. By the time I returned to camp, the day had slipped away. The sun was low in the sky, and the shadows were long. My stomach growled in hunger, but my mind was preoccupied with the strange things I had seen during my walk. The marks on the tree, the disturbed ground, and that strange feeling of being watched. I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone, that someone else was out there, in the forest, just beyond my sight. I tried to distract myself, setting up the stove again to cook dinner, but I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something or someone standing at the edge of the clearing. The sounds of the forest, normally comforting, now felt oppressive. Each crack of a branch, each snap of a twig underfoot made me jump. The fire flickered, casting long shadows across the campsite. When night finally fell, I didn't feel like going to bed. Instead, I kept the fire going, its light dancing in the otherwise pitch-black night. I couldn't bring myself to sleep, not with that feeling gnawing at me. I stayed awake, staring into the fire, trying to push the thoughts from my mind. Then, just as I was starting to feel like I might be able to relax again, I heard it, a noise, quiet at first, just barely audible above the crackling fire. It was a soft shuffle, followed by a low scraping sound, not far from the camp. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. It wasn't an animal. The sound was too deliberate, too slow. I reached for the flashlight in my bag, my hands shaking as I turned it on. I slowly pointed the beam into the darkness. Nothing, just trees, shadows, and the lingering mist that hung around the lake. I stood there for a long time, my flashlight scanning every inch of the clearing. But I didn't see anything. The sound had stopped. Reluctantly, I let the beam of the flashlight rest on the ground. After what felt like hours, the anxiety began to subside. My rational mind took over, reminding me that I was probably just being paranoid. I convinced myself that I had overthought everything. The odd marks on the trees, the strange noises. These were just the product of an overactive imagination. It was getting late and I was exhausted. So, I decided to crawl into my tent and get some sleep. That was the last time I felt completely safe. The next morning, when I packed up my things to leave, I found something that chilled me to my core. It was a small item, tucked under the corner of my tent. A knife, not one that I recognized. It wasn't mine, and I couldn't figure out how it had gotten there. I was positive that it hadn't been there when I set up camp the night before. That's when I knew. Someone had been watching me. Someone had been close. I didn't stay around to figure out who. I packed up my things quickly, and without looking back, I left. The forest near Lake Eastwood was beautiful, no doubt. But I knew, with a certainty that still makes my skin crawl, that there was something in those woods, something human, that didn't want me there. And with that, I never went back. It was the middle of September, and I'd been craving the quiet solitude of the wilderness for weeks. I'm not exactly an expert outdoorsman, but there's something about the simplicity of the woods that I find peaceful. So, I decided to take a weekend camping trip by myself, far enough from civilization where I could disconnect and just clear my head. No phones, no distractions, just the forest and me. I chose a spot in the Cascade Mountains, not too far from my hometown of Bellingham, Washington. It was remote enough that it wouldn't be crowded, but still accessible if I needed to turn back. The weather forecast was perfect for a weekend in the woods. Cool, crisp air, and just enough sunshine to keep the chill away. I arrived late in the afternoon, around 4 o'clock. The drive was long, but the scenery was incredible. The trees were changing, their leaves a mix of deep reds, oranges, and yellows, and the air smelled like pine and fresh earth. I found a spot near a creek, its water tumbling over rocks in a steady, calming rhythm. Felt like the right place to set up camp. The first thing I did was gather some firewood. It took me a little while, but eventually, I had a nice pile ready for when the sun started to dip behind the trees. The forest was silent, save for the occasional rustle of a squirrel or bird in the distance. That silence felt heavy in a way. Not oppressive, but something in it made me feel small, like I was just a visitor here, not the other way around. By the time I had the tent set up, the sky had already started to fade into twilight. I decided to make some dinner before the darkness fully took over. I wasn't a master chef, but I had brought some freeze-dried meals, easy to prepare with just hot water. As I boiled the water over the camp stove, the smell of the food filled the air, adding an odd comfort to the otherwise empty surroundings. As the light disappeared and the stars began to show, I felt the full isolation of the place. The warmth from the fire was nice, but the woods seemed to press in on me. My thoughts were racing, as they often did when I was alone. I started to wonder if I'd made a mistake coming out here by myself. There's something about the quiet of nature that can start to feel unnerving, especially when you're alone. I shook my head and decided to distract myself. I pulled out my book and tried to focus on reading, but every time a twig snapped or the wind rustled through the trees, my attention would shift. I kept hearing things too, not animal sounds, but something more deliberate. It was like there was someone else out there. I tell myself it was just my imagination, the shadows playing tricks, but that feeling kept creeping up on me. Around 9, I decided to turn in. The temperature had dropped quickly, and the fire was starting to die down. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, hoping the comfort of the tent would help me settle. But sleep didn't come easily. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear something, a sound just on the edge of my awareness. It was like the forest itself was holding its breath. Finally, around midnight, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed out of the tent. My breath was visible in the cold night air, and the light of the flashlight barely cut through the dark. I scanned the area, but everything seemed still. Nothing out of the ordinary. No animals, no wind, just silence. I walked a little farther from the campsite, just to reassure myself. I tried to laugh it off. Maybe I was just tired, and the isolation was starting to get to me. But there was still that feeling like eyes were on me. I felt exposed, vulnerable. I made my way back to the camp and spent another few minutes by the fire, staring into the flames. The crackling would sounded louder than usual in the silence of the night. After a while, I decided to call it quits and get some rest. I didn't sleep well that night. Every sound in the forest made my heart race. The wind moving through the trees, the creek's water splashing against the rocks. All of it sounded too loud, too close. At some point, I drifted into a restless sleep, but I kept waking up in short bursts, my eyes snapping open to the pitch-black darkness. I woke up around 5:30 a.m. with the first light of dawn creeping in through the trees. My body was sore from tossing and turning. The temperature had dropped low during the night, and the morning air felt like it was biting my skin. I decided to get up and make breakfast, hoping the activity would clear my mind. The woods were even quieter now, the silence somehow deeper than before. I boiled more water for my meal, but as I was waiting, I heard something. It was faint at first, like a whisper, carried on the wind. But it was definitely a sound, something that didn't belong. I froze. The sound came again, this time clearer. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. It was almost like a voice, distant but persistent. My blood ran cold. I didn't want to think it, but the thought hit me. Someone else was out here. I hadn't seen a soul the entire time I'd been here, but this didn't feel like an animal. It felt like a person, someone who knew I was here. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my heart pounded in my chest. I strained my ears, trying to make sense of the noise, but the whispering stopped as abruptly as it had started. I didn't wait around to investigate. I packed up my things as quickly as I could, throwing everything into my backpack with no real order. I was moving on autopilot, driven more by fear than any actual plan. My hands were shaking as I zipped up the tent, and my eyes kept darting to the edges of the clearing. The whispering came again, but this time it was closer, much closer. I grabbed my flashlight and turned in every direction, but all I could see were the trees, the shadows, and the morning mist. Nothing. I was alone, but it didn't feel that way. I started to break camp faster, my movements erratic. I was already thinking about getting out of there, about the drive back to town, but something kept pulling my attention back to the trees. Every snap of a branch, every creak in the woods seemed too deliberate, too timed with my own movements. I was being watched. Suddenly, the ground beneath my feet shifted. My foot twisted, and I stumbled, catching myself just before falling. The flashlight slipped from my hand, casting a wild beam of light in every direction. When I recovered, I turned around, and that's when I saw it. At the edge of the clearing stood a figure. It wasn't moving, just standing there in the shadow of the trees. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't make out details, but there was something about the way it stood, still and silent, that made the hairs on my arms rise. I felt a cold, creeping terror wash over me. For what felt like an eternity, I stared at the figure. I couldn't make out whether it was a man, woman, or something else entirely. It was just a shape, dark against the forest. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. The figure vanished into the trees without a sound. I didn't wait to see where it went. I grabbed my pack and ran. My legs felt weak beneath me, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I ran through the forest, my heart hammering in my chest, until I reached the trail. I didn't slow down until I was back at the parking lot, out of the woods. Even then, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure emerge from the trees, but nothing happened. I drove back home in silence, the radio off, my mind reeling. I never went back to that spot. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there, watching me, waiting for me to leave. But I made it out. I was safe, and that was all that mattered. Looking back, I can't explain what I saw that day. I can't even say for sure what I heard. But I know what I felt, and that feeling, the one that kept me running, is one I'll never forget. The forest might be beautiful, but it's also a place where you can lose yourself. And maybe, just maybe, there's something in those woods that doesn't want you to leave. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip, just a couple of friends and me heading up to the mountains for a few nights of camping. No big deal, right? Just a little getaway to unwind. But, of course, everything started to go wrong from the moment we set up camp. I remember the weather being perfect when we first arrived. Clear skies, a gentle breeze, and not a cloud in sight. The trees around us were tall, their branches swaying softly, creating a peaceful rustling sound. It felt like one of those picturesque moments you see in magazines, the kind that makes you think everything will go according to plan. We were in the middle of nowhere, in the foothills of the Sierra Nevadas, about a 2-hour drive from the nearest town. The only thing that could be heard, besides the wind, was the distant babble of a stream nearby. We had the usual camping gear, tents, sleeping bags, a cooler, firewood, and, of course, a couple of flashlights. The kind of stuff you grab and don't think much about. It was a Friday afternoon, and after unloading everything, we made camp beside a large rock formation that jutted out from the earth. The site was secluded, which was exactly what we wanted. We weren't here for other people, just a few days of peace and quiet. I was there with 3 friends. Matt, who had been on 1,000 camping trips and loved the outdoors more than anyone else I knew. Jake, a bit of a city boy, always with his phone in hand, but willing to give it a try. And Sarah, my best friend, always up for an adventure and just happy to get out of the house. The first night went pretty smoothly. We set up our tents, had a fire, and cooked some simple food. Matt had brought a guitar along, and we spent a couple of hours singing and laughing around the campfire. The night air was cool but not too cold, and the stars were absolutely stunning. You could see the Milky Way stretching across the sky in a way I'd never seen before. It was perfect, the kind of evening that makes you think everything's right with the world. But then, things started to feel off. It wasn't anything huge at first, just little things, like the way the wind would stop, then suddenly pick up again, much stronger than before. It would gust through the trees, making the branches creak and groan, as if something was moving in them. I remember looking around at the shadows, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't quite shake the feeling that something was watching us from beyond the firelight. It was silly, I know, the kind of feeling you get when you're deep in the woods, far away from any signs of civilization. But it felt real and it made me uneasy. Jake, who had been glued to his phone the whole trip, suddenly got quiet. He glanced around, like he was sensing something too. "What's with the weather?" he asked, but there was an edge to his voice. "It was fine when we got here." I looked up at the sky. It was still clear, but the air was definitely thicker now. The temperature seemed to drop a little too, like a chill that had crept in without warning. I didn't say anything, but I felt it too. That strange pressure in the air, like the atmosphere was heavy with something we couldn't see. We all stayed by the fire a little longer, trying to shrug off the weird vibe. Matt kept playing the guitar, Sarah suggested we roast marshmallows, and we all tried to act normal, even though I could tell we were all feeling it. But after a while, I noticed the shadows again, the way they moved unnaturally, like they were shifting just a little too fast. And that's when I heard it. It was faint at first, a rustling sound, like something large moving through the underbrush just beyond the firelight. I froze. I tried to shake it off, but my heart was already pounding. My eyes darted from the trees to the dark corners of the camp, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever it was. But there was nothing. "Did you hear that?" I asked quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. Matt stopped playing the guitar and looked at me. "Hear what?" "That rustling," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Like something moving around out there." Jake had put his phone down now and was staring at the trees. His face was pale and he looked a little freaked out. "Yeah, I heard it too. It's probably just a deer or something." But I wasn't so sure. The sound was different from any animal I'd heard before. It was too deliberate, too close, like something or someone was actively circling our camp. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. We stayed by the fire for a while longer, the air getting colder as the minutes dragged on. But eventually, the unease became too much. We decided to head to our tents for the night, each of us trying to pretend like everything was fine. Inside my tent, I tried to fall asleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there. I kept hearing faint noises, scratching sounds, like nails on tree bark, or the snap of a twig underfoot. Every now and then, I would hear a voice, not a shout, just a whisper, so faint it could have been my imagination. But each time I strained to listen, it stopped. I lay there in the dark, wide awake, feeling the cold creep into my bones, and I wondered if anyone else was feeling the same way. The next morning, we woke up to find the campsite in disarray. It wasn't much, just a few things out of place, but it was enough to make us uneasy. Our backpacks had been opened, and food had been disturbed. Some of the firewood we'd stacked was scattered around the camp, as if someone had knocked it over. Could have been an animal, I guess, but something about the way the items were moved made it feel deliberate, like someone had been searching through our stuff. I tried to convince myself it was probably just a raccoon or something, but the longer I thought about it, the more it didn't sit right. We checked our tents, but nothing seemed to be missing, so we brushed it off as best we could. Matt even joked that it was probably just a curious bear, but none of us laughed. The whole camp had this tense, nervous energy now, like we were all waiting for something to happen. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, and we tried to relax. We went on a short hike, explored the nearby stream, and even managed to enjoy a peaceful lunch by the water. But when night came again, things got weird. Around the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I noticed something moving on the edge of the forest. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light or maybe a deer, but it wasn't. The figure was too tall, too thin. It moved in jerky, unnatural motions, as if it didn't belong in the natural rhythm of the forest. My heart skipped a beat, and I tried to dismiss it as just my nerves acting up, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. I wasn't the only one who saw it. Jake noticed it too. We both froze for a second, our eyes locked on the dark shape in the trees. We couldn't make out any details, but it was enough to send a chill down our spines. I quickly turned to Matt, hoping he hadn't seen it, but his face was pale, his eyes wide. "Matt?" I started, but I couldn't finish the sentence. He just nodded, his lips pressed tight together. He didn't need to say anything. We all knew something was off. The fire crackled as the shadows around us deepened. No one spoke. There was a heavy silence hanging over the camp, and it felt like the world had paused, waiting for something to happen. And then it did. The rustling came again, but this time, it wasn't distant. It was close, too close. Came from the edge of the camp, right at the tree line. Whatever it was circling us. I could feel my pulse quicken, my breath catching in my throat. The air grew thick again, and the wind stopped, leaving only the sound of the crackling fire and the occasional snap of a branch in the distance. We all stood up at once, eyes darting to the trees. My heart pounded in my chest, and I was ready to grab the nearest thing I could find to defend myself. But the noise stopped, just like that, and then, from somewhere out in the woods, I heard a voice. It was so faint, barely audible, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. "Leave, now." It wasn't a shout or a scream, just a whisper carried by the wind. But the tone was unmistakable. It wasn't friendly. It wasn't a warning. It was a command. We didn't wait around to hear more. We grabbed our things, rushed to the cars, and didn't look back. We drove through the night, the headlights slicing through the darkness, and when we finally reached the nearest town, we were all silent. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the whispers in my head, the shadowy figure, the way everything just felt wrong. I still don't know what we encountered out there, but I'm certain it wasn't anything good. And the worst part? I can't shake the feeling that whatever it was is still out there, waiting. It might have been just a freak incident, but I can't help wondering if something was trying to warn us, or worse, if it was trying to trap us. But that's the thing about the woods. You can never really know what's watching you in the dark, and sometimes it's better not to know at all. It was the fall of 2023, and I had just turned 24. I'd always loved nature. Camping, hiking, fishing, anything that got me away from the noise of the city. A few months back, I had read about a secluded campsite deep in the woods of northern Colorado, about 5 hours from Denver. The reviews were mostly good, with a few warnings about how isolated it was. The idea of being that far removed from civilization had an odd appeal. So I decided to go. I wasn't alone, though. My best friend, Jake, was coming with me. We had known each other since high school, and though we had gone our separate ways in life, we still made the effort to do things like this. Jake was the more adventurous one. While I appreciated nature, he lived for it. His idea of a good time was trekking through the wild with nothing but a pack and a few supplies. We packed up our gear, tents, sleeping bags, food, and of course our hunting knives. We were planning to stay for the weekend, just two guys in the middle of nowhere, no distractions, no phones, just the sound of the wind through the trees. It was late afternoon when we reached the trailhead. The sun was already starting to dip behind the mountain peaks, casting long shadows on the forest floor. I could feel the temperature dropping as we unloaded the truck and began our hike toward the campsite. The air smelled fresh, like pine needles and earth, and there was a crispness to it that told me winter wasn't far off. The hike took us several hours, and by the time we reached the clearing where the campsite was supposed to be, it was dark. We weren't surprised. We had planned for it. Jake had a headlamp and I had my flashlight. Setting up the tents in the dark wasn't ideal, but we managed, and before long we had a fire going in the pit. Sitting around the fire, we cracked open a couple of beers and talked about old times. It was nice, relaxing, but something felt off, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Maybe it was the isolation, the fact that we were so far from any kind of help if something went wrong. Maybe it was just the deep silence of the woods at night. There was no wind, no animals, just the crackling of the fire and the distant sound of a creek that we couldn't quite see. "I'll be glad to get some sleep tonight," I said, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had crept into my chest. "I'm exhausted." "Yeah, me too," Jake replied, his eyes flicking toward the tree line. "But something's weird about this place." I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Jake took a long swig from his beer. I don't know, man. I've camped in some pretty remote places before, but this place just feels wrong. Like it's too quiet, you know? I chuckled, trying to ease the tension. It's just a quiet spot. You're imagining things. But Jake didn't seem convinced. He stared into the woods, eyes narrowing as if he were trying to make sense of something. I glanced over at the tree line too, but all I saw was darkness. The kind of darkness that swallows sound. The kind that makes you feel like something is lurking just beyond your sight, but you can't tell if it's just your mind playing tricks on you or if there's actually something there. I'll be fine, Jake muttered, standing up. Just need a few minutes. I'm gonna take a walk. All right, I said, not thinking much of it. Jake had always liked to wander off when we camped. It wasn't unusual. I watched him disappear into the trees, his headlamp bobbing in the distance, and I returned my attention to the fire. I tried to relax, telling myself that Jake was just being paranoid. The air was getting colder, and I found myself pulling my jacket tighter around me. The wind had picked up, rustling the branches above, and I could hear the distant call of an owl. It was peaceful, but then the crackling of the fire stopped. I didn't think much of it at first. Sometimes the logs shifted and made quieter sounds. But then I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a low, guttural noise, almost like a growl. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. My mind raced, trying to process what I had heard. I strained my ears, but the noise didn't come again. I scanned the trees, thinking it was just an animal. Maybe a bear or a wolf, but it didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. I grabbed the flashlight, flicked it on, and pointed it toward the noise. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees in sharp contrast. But there was nothing there. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My nerves were starting to get the better of me. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks. I told myself I was being ridiculous and tried to ignore the tension building in my chest. But then I heard it again, this time much closer. I stood up, heart pounding. My first thought was that Jake was messing with me, but then I remembered Jake was supposed to be on the other side of the clearing. I turned around, shining the flashlight behind me, but there was nothing. My mind raced. The noise was too deliberate, too close. It wasn't an animal. It was something else. I moved quickly to the fire pit, grabbed my hunting knife, and held it in front of me, my hand shaking slightly. I had no idea what was going on, but the growing sense of dread was overwhelming. Seconds felt like hours as I waited, trying to make sense of the situation. That's when I heard something that made my stomach drop. A snap. I wasn't alone. I've always loved camping. The smell of pine trees, the sound of crackling fires, the feeling of being away from everything. It was pure peace. I usually went with my close friends, and we'd pick spots far enough off the beaten path to escape the crowds. That's why when we planned our trip to the Deschutes National Forest, it seemed like a perfect getaway. No one around for miles, just us and the wilderness. This trip was different, though. I felt an odd sense of unease before we even left, a strange feeling that I couldn't shake, but I brushed it off as nerves. Everyone gets them before a trip, right? We drove up on a Friday afternoon. The air was already starting to cool, and the clouds hung heavy in the sky. My friends, Tom, Sarah, and Matt were all pumped. I remember Matt was cracking jokes in the back seat, and Tom was already talking about the fishing spot he had read about. Sarah, ever the nature enthusiast, was already gushing about the hiking trails. I wasn't really in the mood to talk much, and so I just stared out the window, watching the landscape change as we left the town behind. We arrived just as the sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows across the campsite. The campground was remote, nestled in a dense patch of woods, the kind that made you feel small in the best way possible. There were no other campers in sight, just us and the quiet of the trees. We parked by a creek, the sound of water running gently in the background. Our campsite was perfect for the kind of trip we had in mind. Isolated, surrounded by towering trees, and with the creek nearby to keep things cool. The first thing we did was set up the tents. I was assigned to the farthest tent, a bit away from the others, near the edge of the woods. Not a problem, I figured it'd be peaceful. Night came fast and we started a fire. The warmth felt nice against the growing chill in the air, and we settled in, roasting marshmallows and talking. The woods were quiet. Too quiet, actually. It felt like the forest was holding its breath. I glanced around, noticing how dark it had gotten so quickly. The kind of dark that swallows everything around you. I shrugged it off again. I'm sure it's nothing. Around midnight, we finished eating and the conversation slowed. The fire crackled and popped, and everyone seemed to drift off into their own thoughts. I looked up at the stars. It was amazing how clear the sky was. No light pollution at all. Just millions of stars scattered across the black canvas above. That's when I heard it. A rustling sound, just outside the light of the campfire. It wasn't the usual night sounds, the wind, the leaves, or the animals. This was different, deliberate, almost like something large was moving through the underbrush. I froze, eyes snapping toward the noise. I could see nothing, just darkness beyond the firelight. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Tom, who was closest, turned to look. He didn't respond at first. Instead, he stood up, his silhouette dark against the fire's glow. "Probably just an animal," he said with a shrug. "Maybe a deer or something." But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't an animal. It felt heavier, more intentional. The air around us seemed to grow colder, and the fire crackled louder, like it was trying to fight off whatever was in the woods. Sarah, sitting next to me, shivered. It wasn't from the cold. Her eyes darted around, searching the shadows. "It's getting late," Matt said, pulling his jacket tighter around his shoulders. "We should probably head to bed soon." I nodded, not feeling all that eager to sleep, but I didn't want to be the only one staying up, so I reluctantly followed the others to the tents. As I settled into my sleeping bag, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. I listened carefully to the sounds of the woods, trying to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks. The wind rustled the trees, and I could hear the creek flowing gently nearby, but there was something else, something I couldn't identify. I don't know how long I lay there, staring up at the fabric of my tent, but eventually, I must have drifted off to sleep. That's when I heard it again, louder this time, a loud snapping of branches, like something large moving through the forest. I jolted awake, my heart pounding in my chest. The tent was still dark, but the sound continued, closer now, like something was circling us. I held my breath, straining to hear. My mind raced through all the possibilities, wild animals, other campers, maybe even a person, though that seemed unlikely. But no, this was something different. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't another person. It was something worse. I could feel it in my gut, an overwhelming sense of dread that made my body freeze. The sound stopped for a moment, and for a brief second, I thought I might have imagined it. But then, right next to my tent, I heard a low grunt, like something exhaling. It was unmistakable, a deep, guttural sound. I barely dared to breathe. I lay there, frozen, eyes wide in the darkness. Couldn't move, couldn't think. The only thing I could hear was the pounding of my own heart in my ears. And then I heard something that made my blood run cold. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, just outside my tent. I held my breath, praying it would stop. Please just stop. Didn't. The footsteps continued, moving around the perimeter of my tent. Whoever or whatever was out there was circling me, getting closer and closer with every step. I reached for my flashlight, my hands trembling. I knew I had to do something. If I didn't, I'd be completely at its mercy. Just as I was about to flick on the flashlight, the footsteps stopped. And then, silence. It felt like hours passed in that silence, though I knew it had only been a few minutes. My mind raced, trying to make sense of everything. I could hear my friends snoring softly in their tents, completely unaware of what was happening. Then, I heard something even worse. A voice. A whisper. So faint I almost thought I imagined it. But no, it was real. And it was right outside my tent. "You're not alone." I froze. The voice wasn't like anyone I knew. It was distorted, rough, almost like a growl mixed with a human voice. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't think. My mind was racing, but my body refused to move. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was paralyzed by fear. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. No more footsteps, no more whispers, just the sound of the creek and the wind in the trees. I lay there for what felt like forever, unable to move, unsure of whether I had imagined it or not. But deep down, I knew it hadn't been a dream. Something was out there, something watching me. Eventually, the sky began to lighten, the first rays of dawn creeping through the trees. The woods looked normal again, peaceful even, but the unease remained in my chest. I waited until I could hear Matt's slow, sleepy voice from the other tent. I could see Sarah stirring too. The others were waking up. Did anyone else hear something last night? I asked, trying to sound casual. Tom groggily looked up, rubbing his eyes. Hear what? Footsteps. Someone walking around the tents. It sounded like it was trying to get close, I said. Matt laughed softly. Man, you're hearing things. It was probably a bear or something, but I wasn't so sure. I knew what I had heard, and I wasn't about to go back to sleep. That day, we packed up early and left the campsite, none of us mentioning what had happened. The forest was still silent, but I felt like something was there, something watching us. And as we drove out of the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been out there had never really left. Even now, years later, I can't explain what happened that night. Was it an animal, person, or something else entirely? I'll never know. But I do know this. Some places are meant to be left undisturbed, and I'll never make the mistake of camping in that forest again.